Shall we start? Because we don't have much time in here. I don't want to kind of like hold on. Again, let me introduce myself. My name is Spencer Leung. I'm from Hong Kong, but based in Bangkok, Thailand at the moment. I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow, graduate from the Chulalongkorn University in 2013, class 15. Today, we are very honored actually to have a group of panelists who are experts in the human rights issues in the Middle East in here to share some of their thoughts in this area. And most importantly is that as a Peace Fellows, right, we all want to try something to address the human rights issue worldwide, not only within the Middle East areas in here. And we are very honored to have members of the board of the associations to join us at this event. Her name is Rukmini, and she's gonna say a few words about the association, about the initiative we try to move forward. Over to you, Rukmini.
Thank you, Spencer. And hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is Rukmini, as Spencer introduced. I am based in Mumbai in India, and I am a Rotary Peace Fellow from Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. And thank you for being here. It's my privilege to welcome all of you to this very important conversation. And we hope sincerely that this is one of many conversations related to human rights. And more importantly, we hope that these conversations act as a precursor to local action on the ground. For those of us who are not familiar with the Rotary Peace Fellows Alumni Association, this is a collective of Rotary Peace Fellows that's come to be organized beautifully and rather fruitfully, I must say, after the Hamburg conference in 2019, very fortuitously just before COVID struck. And as a result, during the pandemic, we were able to get together through the association and organize several regional events and webinars, 2 global peace conferences, and quite a few other initiatives as well. One of these initiatives happens to be what you're seeing today, which is a human rights action group, which has come up as an offshoot of Peace Fellows who are concerned about human rights related issues in different parts of the world. And so far today we'll hear about Palestine from this wonderful group, but we've also had groups which are currently actively working on Afghanistan. We've also attempted to work with Peace Fellows and the situation in Myanmar in the past. And we hope that this conversation is one of the many, not only in terms of us speaking about it, but also in terms of us being able to organize each other, offer ourselves as resources, and be able to make some active impact on the ground. So thank you for joining us here. And I sincerely hope that all of us put together are able to actively contribute to not just this conversation, but also to eventual action as far as the Palestine issue is concerned for today. This event is organized by the Rotary Peace Fellows Alumni Association with the support of Solidarity 2020 and Beyond and Waging Nonviolence. So those are our co-sponsors of this webinar. And with that, I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers for today and turn it over to them very shortly. The moderator for this conversation is Catherine Hughes-Freytag. And Catherine is a Peace Fellow from Chulalongkorn. And she is a specialist in Middle East, Palestine, Israel, of course, but also Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and several other countries in the Gulf region. And she has worked in this space for well over 30 years in over 70 countries. So you can imagine the richness of experience that she brings to this conversation. And she has been, in a way, the pillar of the human rights group related to Palestine. And she'll be moderating this conversation with our panelists. I'm going to do really short introductions of the panelists so that we have more time left to hear from them. And these introductions might perhaps not do justice, but hopefully, as we hear them today, we will also get to know more about what they do. One of our panelists is Professor Mazin Kumsiye, who's also a member of the Rotary Club of Bethlehem in Palestine, and he is the founder and volunteer director for the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University. He's been awarded for a lot of his work. He's also published a lot of papers, book chapters, and books which range from cultural heritage to human rights to biodiversity conservation to cancer. So you can imagine how eclectic he is and the scope of his work is. We also have with us Suhair Vardi. Suhair is from Israel. She's from Jerusalem, and she's an anti-militarist and a human rights activist. And she led the Israel program for the American Friends Service Committee for 10 years. And she also, in that tenure, she also founded the database of Israeli military and security export. Currently, she is a Rotary Peace Fellow at University of Bradford in the UK. We also have with us Reem Gunaim. Reem is originally from Palestine, and she is a positive peace activator, a Global Peace Index ambassador for the Institute of Economics and Peace. And she's had a long association with Rotary, having started off as a Rotaractor way back in Ramallah. And she's also, of course, a Peace Fellow from the University of North Carolina. Currently, she leads her own company at the Founder Institute. And finally, we have Suhair. Suhair Freytag is from Palestine. Again, she's currently based in Ramallah. And she's strongly been committed to the peace and development space in terms of working on peace initiatives, as well as working with several international NGOs on various projects. She is also a current Peace Fellow at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. So with that, Catherine, over to you, and you can tell us how you'd like to structure the way forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Rukmini and Spencer, and really appreciate you all hosting this today and all the major support that you're giving from the board and from the Asia Action Group. And welcome to everyone that has joined. We had, I think, 165 or 67 people sign up, so we're hoping more people will join us. But this is an amazing group of people that have come together, and we have amazing panelists, as you can hear. Over 200 years of combined experience when I tried to add it up. Basically, this is the Human Rights in Palestine, an ongoing struggle for peace and justice panel. I have personally worked in the field, I think Rumini mentioned, for about 35 plus years, beginning when I journeyed to Palestine in 1988 during the first Intifada as a young graduate student. And this cause is actually the nearest and dearest to my heart, probably of all the different social justice movements and self-determination movements I work with all around the world. My master's thesis was actually on the first Intifada as a nonviolent resistance model. And then 30 years later, unfortunately, it has not been resolved. And my independent peace analysis project at Chulalongkorn University, where I was in 2020 when COVID hit, was on the so-called violent conflict in Palestine, Israel, but I looked at it through a settler colonialist lens rather than as an equal conflict. I find too often in the field of peace building, the importance of power asymmetry in conflicts is overlooked, as is specifically in the case of Palestine, where the power imbalance of occupier and occupied supported the occupier by the most powerful nation in the world, my country, the US, is much too immense to really see this as a conflict between two equal parties. I currently work with Jewish Voice for Peace members in the US, Jewish allies who strongly pronounce "not in my name." We help to educate the general public that anti-Zionism and criticism of the Israeli state is not the same as anti-Semitism. And this is a much misunderstood issue that has clouded kind of movement forward on really trying to come to a fair and just resolution for this situation. In this panel today, however, we are comprised of Rotarians and Rotary Peace Fellows with direct and lived experience in Palestine and Israel. And we're going to look at several aspects of human rights in Palestine, from a focus on historic popular resistance and people power to environmental justice and climate crisis, from women's economic empowerment and the challenges of dealing with the patriarchy and undemocratic governments, to the skewed perceptions of the general public about Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle, life, and culture. From Israeli Jewish anti-militarist activists shining a light on their own society's support for violence around the world, to standing in solidarity with Palestinian grassroots campaigns. So it's going to be a very interesting and broad discussion. It'll be 90 minutes. We plan to spend about 50 minutes with panel discussion and announcements about the first statement in support of human rights from the group that Rukmini talked about, our Human Rights Action Group. And then about 25 minutes or so for respectful discussion and Q&A with you, our audience. We want you to be engaged and open for comments. You can put your questions or comments in the chat as we move along. And as moderator, I'll try to gather those and get them back to the panelists. So when the time comes, you can either raise your hand and ask directly, we'll unmute you, or we could just read your question that you've chatted. We want this to be a very respectful conversation, and we're sure it will be. But this can be a controversial issue, and so if things get at all heated or unruly, we may end up giving a warning, and if that is a problem, actually having someone that has to be removed from the conversation, because we want this to be peaceful and a just conversation. Many thanks go to Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. It's the international network of grassroots social justice movements working for peace with justice around the world that I co-founded with two other Rotary Peace Fellows, Marita Rainbird from Finland and Vedran Obacina from Croatia, and that I now direct. And then also, Rukmini mentioned Waging Nonviolence, which is an amazing online news and research portal that specializes in studying and telling the stories of nonviolent action and civil resistance by campaigns and movements around the world. And you can find our websites, you can like us on Instagram and Twitter, and we'd love to have you engaged with our groups as well. So with that, I'm going to get started, and we're going to head right into a series of questions for our panelists. And I'm going to start with Mazen. So Mazen, you are an established expert in many areas, including science, academia, organizing, and movement building. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to be involved as a leader in the Palestinian justice and freedom nonviolent movement, as well as your major books and research on popular resistance in Palestine and kind of a general framing of the struggle as you see it?
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. Thanks for the hosts and for the invitation and this opportunity to speak to good people. My background is as a person born in Palestine, of course, from childhood being subjected to Israeli occupation early on and continuing after I returned from the US to Palestine in 2008. I can tell you stories after stories about my encounters with the occupiers, but I do want to say that, the reason I do what I do is very simple. It's actually, I didn't know this at the time, but it is a Rotarian principle. It's service above self. One wants to serve their community. One wants to do something positive, because after all, life is very short. We go through it, and what are we taking with us? We're not going to take cars or houses or anything with us. We might as well try to do something positive in nature. And all my life, I've been searching of how to do positive things in the environment, whether it's through work, on the environmental issues or on the human rights issues, environmental justice issues, helping people who are in need, etc., or in the science field. I mean, the reason I do science also is the same reason. I don't do science for the sake of, something. I'm not working on nanotechnology or anything. I'm working on basic biological things that help humans, like biodiversity conservation, etc., with the climate change, for example. So the point of it, the point of all of this is basically for us as human beings to try and do something positive, leave this place that we inherited from our ancestors, leave it a little better for our own children. This is what drives me. This is what got me into this eclectic, as you pointed out, many fields, because each of them leads to the same point, which is human sustainability and natural sustainability. You're muted, Catherine.
Yes, could you talk a little bit about your, the books that you've written? As I mentioned, we have a little more time for your space here, and they're well known in the field. They're utilized all across the world as understanding kind of the history of Palestine, but also general popular resistance movements. Could you talk a little bit about your work with them?
Right. So basically, what I wrote books because I've been writing emails and other information before emails, even letters to people to try and explain life as I see it, as we see it, as Palestinians see it. The narrative you mentioned earlier, an issue of narrative. The Palestinian narrative is not being told in the West. And especially when I went to the US, I was 21, 22 years old to do my master's degree and PhD degrees in the US. I noticed how little knowledge people have. There's more now, of course, but at that time there was much less knowledge of what's going on. So I was explaining to people, and by explaining to people, by writing to people, etc., this treasure trove of writings, if you want, accumulated, and people started telling me, well, you should put it in a book or something. So I finally succumbed to the pressures, and I created my first book on sharing the land of Canaan, human rights and the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. And then that was followed by others. But the point of it about, putting things together is like our ancestors in the caves telling stories. People like to tell stories with the idea that the others are willing to listen to those stories. The other book I wrote that's relevant to this subject that we are discussing is a book on popular resistance in Palestine, which is subtitled The History of Hope and Empowerment. And the idea of this book came to me because, in the West, they kept making Palestinians look like this monolith of terrorists that are about to kill Israelis. So I wanted to tell the real history of Palestinians, like Native Americans, like Blacks in South Africa under apartheid. They have a history. They are not, as Edward Said said, sometimes are not allowed to tell this history or tell their own stories. So I proceeded to collect these stories going back to 1880, basically, the first encounter between the native indigenous people of Palestine with the European settlers who came, Jewish settlers who came with the idea of colonizing the country. And they actually called the first group they set up Jewish Colonization Association. So I was trying to tell the perspective of the locals in terms of what happened and how they interacted. And so I was relating those stories, again, just like storytelling, relating the stories of the indigenous people to Western audience primarily, because the Palestinians mostly know, although some of them don't know their own history. but most Palestinians at least know there's a history of popular resistance, for example, and that this history is ongoing today, and even as we speak, there's nonviolent resistance. I was actually on the interview before this one with Isa Amr of the Hebron Youth Against Settlements. And we were talking about the popular resistance and its history in Hebron, and that's an interesting subject on its own.
Okay, thank you, Shukran. Let's move on to Suhair Freytag. And Suhair is a long-term community organizer and leader and researcher and analyst on Palestinian affairs, having been born in Nablus and now based in Ramallah. You're also a Rotary Peace Fellow. Can you talk about how you came to be involved and your experience growing up in occupied territory? Also, your current focus on women's economic empowerment in non-traditional occupations and why you've chosen this area to focus on.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for the hosts and the audience, the participants. It seems like they mostly are my colleagues in the Rotary. I was born in Nablus, as Catherine mentioned. Talking about Nablus and about my childhood, it's being raised under occupation, military occupation, observing the soldiers in the streets, always growing up in a very unstable life, full of curfews, being confined at home. You are not allowed to go to school or to university. You are not allowed to go to even to the roof of your house for some fresh air, because you will face tear gas or you will face soldiers will tell you go down to your house. It's always unstable. You don't have the time or you don't have the ability to make your own plan for your day or for your week or even for your life. The occupation in West Bank, where I was grown up, always create a chaos in my mind. Always create many ideas, trying to find answers for these questions which always raised. When I was still like 4 or 3 years old, the first thing I watched was soldiers, I mean the Israeli soldiers. Basima, I mean Israeli soldiers. Grown up there in Nablus with this kind of this conflict, with this kind of demonstrations in the streets, throwing stones here, setting fire in the cars' tires, seeing all this mess in the streets, and then being a part of going to a funeral for a girl aged like 13 years old. She was killed, and she was killed by the Israeli soldiers, of course, just because she get out from her school, not on the regular times, throw a stone on the patrol, and they just shoot her, and she died, and she's just 13 years old. So these questions always grown up with me. And when I went to the university, I just went to the political science to study the Palestinian question. What's going on with my people, the refugees, the soldiers in the streets. With in my time, there was like the PLO, the revolution in Beirut. They based in Beirut, and you used to listen to that in that time to Yasser Arafat, talking about liberating Palestine, talking about military operations here and there. But I used to ask myself always, so what? What does it mean to have this military operations and there's no consequence or positive reaction. It's what about the resistance, this military resistance. So when I went to work, to the field work, there was the peace process in the 90s. And still I was optimistic like any other Palestinian who felt that this is the time to have peace, and this is the time to get your own life. But the problem is that there were no peace, and we went to a extreme intifada, the second intifada, which led to demolitions, destruction, and even the whole peace process was destroyed. And to get back to myself, to my life, focusing on when I was still in my teenage, going to a curfew at home, it is not only the Israeli occupation forced you to go home. It's also my social traditions, my social morals force me sometimes to go home. You are not allowed to go out just like the boys. You are a woman, you are a girl. We are afraid maybe you will be shot, maybe you will be arrested. You are a girl. You are not allowed even to resist the occupation because you are a girl. Many things had happened in my life. Looking at my sisters at home during these lockdowns, they were like only housemaids. They were for cleaning, for cooking, for not as the boys in my family. They have their own independence. They were free to do what they want. They're free to think. But as a woman, I'm not free to think. So I have these two occupations in a parallel way. And sometimes the domestic occupation was more harsh on me personally, more than the Israeli occupation. Even the Israeli occupation is on everyone. Everyone in Palestine live in that occupation and suffers the pain of the occupation. But for me as a woman or a girl grown up in a very traditional family, of course they push us to education, to be learned, and to have our own independence in education, but not in any other thing. So even in getting your inheritance from your father, it was not allowed to do it because you are a girl and your money will go for your husband. It's very complicated life. I still live in Palestine. It's not I didn't leave that situation. So that's why the last thing happened to me, that I went when I finished my work and I get retired, early retirement, they name it, for health reasons. So I get all my savings during the 20 years and put it in an investment where I failed. I failed because of the masculine and the patriarch looks at me. They looked at a very weak human being. I don't think if they look at me as a human being, they look at me as a woman, but they do not consider the woman as a human being. I don't know why, but this is the complicated situation in my area in Palestine. So when I failed, I looked at myself, and then the chance from the sky came to me. I don't know, the heaven sent it to me to have that fellowship with Rotary. And it was really a good opportunity for me to focus on women and to make that peace building, because I'm really now aware that the peace should come from within, and then I can do it with others. Because if I don't have that kind of peace in my life, in my soul, in my spirit, in my heart, I don't think I can bring it to others, to my kids, to my family. And so I focus on women, empowering women, not only in the job, which it's the non-traditional jobs or careers, but also about women to bring peace in within themselves, before they go to peace in external, to be to have this kind of peace from in your soul, and then you will bring it out, and it will be very easy to spread it.
Thank you very much, Suhair, and you're obviously speaking very much from your heart, and it's hard to hear, but we really appreciate you sharing. And the next round, we'll get a little bit more into the details of your project and how you're supporting and working to help women and work on economic empowerment specifically. Reem, we're going to head to you next. As a Palestinian and now international citizen residing in the US, where you completed a Rotary Peace Fellowship at the University of North Carolina and led the Rotary Action Group for Peace through mid-2021 as their executive director, talk about your history and how you came to be involved with peace building and working for human rights and justice for your people and others. Describe your experience with others' perceptions of Palestinians and Palestine, and how you're working to change some of these skewed and biased views. Go ahead.
Thank you, Catherine. Really, my story has a lot of similarities to what my fellow panelists highlighted in certain ways. But to address your question, growing up in Palestine, I experienced the military occupation closely and domestically. And then when I went to the US to pursue my career in education, I also experienced it internationally through the systems, the embedded narratives and perceptions. And with COVID, when COVID hit, I experienced it in a new way, in a more obvious way that I didn't, realize before, which is in cyberspace. The occupation exists in all spaces in my life, just because, I am a Palestinian and my experience of it is a little bit different. And what I noticed through all these experiences, that there's a disconnect that is became obvious, that happens between at the levels of mass media, print media, and social media. And I would like to share with you some of these experiences in all three. So growing up, I realized I was born on the wrong side, basically, because I identified by a green ID, and my Israeli counterparts were identified by a blue ID. Suddenly, I have a different ID. And when I was a kid and I experienced curfews, I was not allowed to go to school under curfew, when my Israeli counterparts could go to school. Also, when we drove our cars, the Palestinian cars have a green label and Israeli cars have a yellow label. So Palestinians must wait on checkpoints for hours, and Israeli cars pass us by without stopping and by the checkpoints. So those are some of the things that I witnessed on a daily basis, like some of the highlights. But this is the most important point. Settlers in the West Bank and Gaza settlers in the West Bank are subject to civilian law, whereas Palestinians in the West Bank are subject to military law. This means that every Palestinian can potentially become a military target at any time. And I will demonstrate that through a story. My friend from high school shared with me how she witnessed, her name is Reem as well, how she witnessed from her bedroom window during one of the invasions, the unjustified killing of a high school boy named Tahir. And I personally saw, I know Tahir and I know his family. I knew him as another classmate's brother. During the invasion, his friend confronted. There's some.
Now you're muted, Reem. I think Spencer may have muted whoever unmuted. So yeah, we'll have you back. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so during the invasion, Tahir and his friend confronted an Israeli tank on our city streets with a Molotov. The tank was unharmed. These boys and their boys did not did not present a lethal threat. However, the Israeli soldier shot Taher dead. His friend was left to contemplate if he would be next. I visited my classmate to mourn her brother's death, and I felt I had also lost a brother. Taher and his friend were expressing the frustration they felt all their lives. They received a response that was disproportionate. They were in this position because of all the injustice imposed on them because of their identity as Palestinians. Many younger men from many countries put in the same situation might make the same teenage choice. This is one example of murders of Palestinians for insufficient reasons on checkpoints, during invasions, and even at times of supposed peace. These killings are committed without the due process of a fair justice system. This is an example of being a civilian subject to military law and occupation. So all these experiences growing up, I thought must be known to the world. Like, how come nobody knows about this? When I went to the US to study and work, I realized when I started watching the big four television media, including Fox News and CNN, that Palestinians are poorly represented. There was common theme, and that theme is there were many people and experts talking about Palestinians, but there were almost no Palestinians talking about their side of the story.
Yeah.
The commentary was condescending and most times racist. This is a theme that was also noticeable in written media. My suspicions were confirmed when I discovered the findings of Dr. Maha Nassar of Arizona University. She found that this trend was especially striking in the daily press. The New York Times, less than 2%, less than 2% of the nearly 2,500 opinion pieces that discussed Palestinians since 1970 were actually written by Palestinians. In the Washington Post, the average was just 1%. And that was, I want to give you an example of how that must feel for us, who don't have the privilege to speak on these platforms. So the most, like this example from New York Times. So the UAE-Israel so-called peace agreement is another example of that. So Thomas Friedman of the New York Times said, and I quote, that the past does not always have to bury the future. This incorrectly gives the illusion that oppression has stopped when it has not. Palestinians continue to feel unsafe and are worse off every day despite the media's misrepresentation of this agreement as one of peace. Palestinians want peace like all people in the world. A peace agreement without guaranteed peace for the most disfranchised is a suffocation of their plea. It is only a breath of fresh air, as Friedman's article states, to the beneficiaries of this unjust agreement, which do not include the Palestinians. There is no peace without justice. And so this is just an experience, and I'm happy to continue to talk about the social media, but should I continue now, or do you want me to continue that later?
Yeah, thank you so much, Reem, for setting that all up. I think the next round, we'd love for you to get more into the work that you've done there. But I think, you've brought up such important issues, both personal experience and then how it's framed in the U.S. and the total, again, asymmetry of the story and what's being told and who's telling it. So thank you very much.
Catherine, can I just
sure.
want to highlight for the Rotarians.
Sure.
Positive peace, when we think about positive peace as we are, discussing this conversation, let's think about the pillars of positive peace: free flow of information. Let's think about respecting the rights of others. Good governance, like tell me if this is good governance to have people subjugated civilians to military law, and peace and equality. I want people to start really processing this within a framework of peace that we all know and agree to, and assess those these stories and these new information that some of them may know, some of them not, in that peace framework that is universal. So thank you. I just wanted to put that out.
Yeah, and thank you. And Spencer reminded us earlier, which this is International Human Rights Week. December 10th is International Human Rights Day for the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And those are very clearly spelled out. And you're talking about ones that are definitely not followed or implemented for Palestinians. And so that's one of the main things we're talking about today. So thank you for bringing that up. Suhair, now we're going to turn to you. You're the only Israeli citizen on the panel and have been a really important member of our human rights action group thus far. As an Israeli Jewish woman and current Rotary Peace Fellow at the University of Bradford in the UK, how did you come to be involved in working in solidarity with activists for Palestinian human rights, but for human rights and justice in your own country, and an end to oppression and occupation? Talk a little bit about your work in the field of anti-militarism in Israeli society and this really interesting database that you're a part of working on. So we welcome you.
Thank you. So I'll start by saying that if Reem said that she found out that she was born on the wrong side, I found out at some point that I was born on the right side. And so I have a blue ID, as Reem was talking about the difference between the green and blue IDs, which meant just as one form of privilege, it meant that growing up as a child, I didn't need to know what the occupation was or meant. It was always a concept that, a word that you hear around in the news and in, conversations, but it didn't have to mean anything to me because I could just live my life pretty normally. And I think that to an extent that changed a bit in the Second Intifada. And while we can talk a lot about what the Second Intifada meant for Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, and the military operations and the reoccupation of many Palestinian cities and the curfews and things that Suhair has spoken about, Mazen have spoken about, for Israelis, there were buses blowing up in the streets. There was a feeling, and I'm from Jerusalem, so it was very much part of the city fabric at the time. There was a feeling of a need maybe to, or a possibility for a need to wake up and say, this is actually affecting our lives as well. And I had the very kind of lucky experience that during that time, because of the Second Intifada and everything that was happening, my father started becoming a bit more politically aware and was invited by friends of his to a Palestinian village just near Jerusalem, about a 15-minute drive from my house. He was invited to a day of like planting olive trees and, very nice activities that you can bring your kids along to. And so that was my first experience in a Palestinian village, probably at the age of 12. And I kept going to that village for years later. And the wall, the separation barrier, was starting to be at the time. And so while on the media, I was very much told that, this wall is there to protect us from suicide bombers, to separate us and them kind of thing, right? Like that was very much the narrative. But then I'd go to this village and the wall or fence specifically there was separating that village from the neighboring Palestinian village, right? Keeping that village actually in Jerusalem, and this whole conversation of division, of security just didn't make sense on the ground. But what this fence did do, well, I didn't feel the effects of it on the ground at all as an Israeli. It didn't mean anything in my life. But what it did do in that village is change it completely. And talking to kids my age, we were, 12, 13, 14, the things that bothered them were not the things that would make headlines. It's not the big stories, even the stories that Suhair and Reem have shared here around extreme violence, around killings. Though this was a very small, very quiet village, these things didn't even get there. But what bothered kids my age was the fact that because the fence separated them and the neighboring village, this village has a checkpoint, a private checkpoint just for the village, with a list of names of everyone for the village, and only they're allowed in and out. And so for 13-year-old kids, the biggest problem was that you can't invite kids over from school. And that's not a human rights violation that's going to make the headlines. You're not going to hear about that in UN Council, conversations. But that's also a part of the reality of what occupation meant. And for me, that was a lot of understanding that beyond the headlines, it just means a life that you don't have control on. A bunch of 19-year-old kids in uniform have control on. A few years ago, this was probably a decade ago now, I'm still in touch with people from that village, and we get a phone call one day from people in that village saying, listen, we have a very strange situation. Can you please help us out with this? We have a horse stuck outside. And we're like, what do you mean you have a horse stuck outside? And so it turns out there was a horse in the village that was sick, and they took her out to the vet in Bethlehem, and she got whatever treatment needed, and they tried to bring her back in. And the soldier at the checkpoint said, I'm really sorry, but she's not on the list. You know, it's one of those so ridiculous situations that you say, okay, this is like, and it took some phone calls, mostly to reporters who called the military command, who obviously couldn't explain this because it's a bit too ridiculous, and eventually called the soldier at the checkpoint and tell him, you can let the horse through, it's fine. And the moment that order came down, the soldier was, you know, very happy to let the horse in, and everything kind of went back as normal. And I think one of the things that really struck me in that story was first of all that absurdity is what occupation looks like when it works, right? When there's nothing that went terribly wrong in that situation. Actually, the Palestinians had who to contact. When that contact was made, eventually the problem was solved, so to speak. That's the best case scenario of what an occupation can look like. And all of us can, that makes no sense, right? And the other thing was the soldier, because the Palestinians that I was speaking to kept saying, like, we kept being like, you know, tell the soldier it's ridiculous. And they kept saying, he's being really nice. Like he was actually very happy when he was let in the end, given the order. He was just in his mind, he was just like, I'm not allowed to. I'm just following orders. That's all I can do here. And I think that for me is a lot of the core of understanding occupation, that it's created out of so many people who are just doing what they're told, right? And I think that is why when we talk about Israeli occupation, we have to talk about militarism as well. And militarism is conscription, is the fact that we're talking about a group of 19-year-old kids. And that manifests in the stories we have to tell ourselves, the education system that has to be created in order to have 18-year-old kids join the military, in order for have them believe that what they're doing when they're standing in that checkpoint and very ridiculously preventing a horse from going into a village is security. It's about their survival, and that is how we are brought up. And there's a million examples of how that narrative is created through holidays, through the way that we learn history, through obviously the connection that is made to the Holocaust and to oppression of Jews, and this kind of narrative that we have to protect ourselves that somehow eventually translates to that kid in that checkpoint. And I think it is really important to talk about that. But when we talk about different aspects of militarism, there is that social, educational one, but we also have to talk about the one that isn't as visible, which is the economic one, because Israel has developed an extremely large military industry that today makes the Israeli economy dependent on that industry, dependent on arms export. And I mean, Israel today is between the 7th and 8th biggest exporter of arms in the world. SIPRI, the Stockholm International Institute for Peace Studies, just issued their new release about their new report about this past COVID year. And Israel arms export is going up. Generally, the fact that arms export in the world has gone up during COVID should be alarming to all of us. You'd think countries would have other priorities, but this is also true for Israel. And that industry is dependent on the occupation. It's dependent on the ability to test, develop, and more importantly, market weapons as one that were actually tried on the field, as battle proven. You literally go to arms export, you will see posters with Israeli drones that were used in Gaza that'll have a stamp on them saying battle proof, and that's literally how they sell these weapons. And if if the Israeli economy has become dependent on that, and then that is dependent on the occupation, we have a whole other invisible aspect of the occupation that has to be talked about, that has strong relationships internationally, and therefore a lot that can be done internationally. And the database that Catherine was talking about before, the database of Israeli military and security export, is trying to reveal some of those realities, and I'm happy to speak about it more later.
Thank you very much, Suhair. You know, that it's so amazing how you kind of went to this personal story and the ludicrousy of what occupation can be, and then to the larger, you know, issues of militarism and economy and some brainwashing that happens within the society, very similar to the U.S. and the militarism here. We have many similar issues, so we'll look forward to hearing more about it. And if you want to put that in the link about the database, that would be really helpful. I'm headed back now. We're going to have a second round of questions and answers from our panelists. Let's look at about 4 to 5 minutes each, so that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. And Mazen, I want to head back to you. You had a lot of your recent work that you've been doing focused on building environmental coalitions, projects focusing on biodiversity and climate change and climate crisis in Palestine and the broader region. Can you tell us why you think this work is so critical among all these other issues that you're dealing with, and about the group objectives and activities of the groups you work with and how they fit within your work for peace building and justice?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, as everybody here probably already knows, if they were not knowledgeable a few years ago, they became knowledgeable quickly, that we face an existential crisis as a species, that Earth is not doing so well, that the climate change is wreaking havoc in many areas of our planet. We biologists, my background is in biology originally. I finished bachelor, master, and PhD in biology, where I went into medical genetics a little bit, and then back into biodiversity. But we, people like me, have been warning about this for decades, saying that the trend of consumerism, capitalism, trend of destroying the planet via excessive exploitation, habitat destruction, you know, these things are not sustainable. Agriculture, the way it's practiced, is not sustainable. We've been saying this. People have been partially listening to us, but as the events unfolded in the past few years and the climate change accelerated, people started seeing things in their own backyards, like fires and floods and increased hurricanes and tornadoes and so forth. They started asking for more information. We should not just complain about things, and that was my philosophy from the beginning. We should create an alternative reality going forward. So basically, a few years ago, my wife and I invested our savings from living in the US for a while and donated it to Bethlehem University and started this Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability. And we're both full-time volunteers here, 120, 130 hours a week, basically, that we are spending. It's called the Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability for a good reason. Biodiversity is what keeps us alive on this planet, and we need sustainability as a species. We need to have sustainable human and natural communities, and we need to do them grassroots up, not top down. So we have been working with communities like farmers, increasing their production of agricultural produce, local production and consumption. We showed that we actually increased production for 81 farmers by 40% over a 2.5-year project. And we are doing a lot of projects like this that relate to recycling, upcycling, childhood education, women empowerment. We do a lot of activities with the women here in terms of using organic produce to create household products and things like that. So we have a lot of activities along those lines. And we have been getting a lot of volunteers from around the world. You know, Suhair is here behind me. Actually, she's Israeli also, and she's been volunteering with us for a long time and staying with us. So we welcome volunteers. Any of you want to come and volunteer, work with us, we provide room and board. And you can work in our botanic garden or in the museum. We have Museum of Natural History. We have a Museum of Ethnography and many other activities, educational activities that we're doing with children. So the idea of this is, again, you know, how do we change the status quo and create an alternative reality? Our motto here is respect. We start with respect for ourselves, then respect for other human beings, regardless of their background, and then respect for nature. Those are the three levels of respect, but it starts with ourselves, respecting ourselves, self-empowerment, changing ourselves before we want to change other people or anything. We create an environment in which children learn, children develop. We don't educate them, we create an environment for learning. And just like we create an environment for seeds to grow in our garden, we create an environment for children of all ages, from 3 years old to 93 years old, to really develop and grow.
Thank you, Mazen. And I know when I've been there, I really enjoy going to the Palestine National History Museum, and you give me tours of your work and the amazing volunteers that are there and the amazing outreach, you know, programs that you have. So thank you for that work. I want to turn back to Suhair. And Suhair, we got started on a lot of issues around women and your own experience. Let's hone in on some of the economic empowerment project that you're working on now, how you're engaging with Palestinian women to support them in non-traditional occupations, to help, as you said, empower them not only from the outside economically, but from within. That is so important. Go ahead, let us know what you're working on.
Well, I want to say, is the voice clear?
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to focus on women, not as a vulnerable sector in the community. They are half the community in Palestine. They are 49% of people in Palestine. So they are strong enough. Even when I read about women at the beginning of the 20th century, they were very active in creating charitable organizations, involving in helping people, and they were like, even despite all the challenges they are facing from the patriarch community, but they are still strong and they are fighting for their humanity and for identity as a human beings in the community. So they used to struggle to participate in the national struggle, which is in the 20th and the 13th of the last century, about creating and confiscating land for Israel, and in the same time they used to work for the welfare of their communities. So the women always were there. The Palestinian women were always there in the struggle and at home and in the fields and as farmers, as doctors, as in all the professionals. But in the 70s, after in the 70s, after the occupation in 1967 to West Bank and Gaza, the women's role has changed. They become more political. They become more active in fighting the occupation, and And in the same time, they used to form the cooperative forms, training centers, kindergartens, and this had been increased more during the first Intifada in 1987. The women there became like leaders in their societies. The men, the young men, were involved in the Intifada and the other things like throwing stones and all this military or the military tools, but the women went for social and economic tools to empower their societies. And because in that time schools were closed totally, so the women, the mothers of the kids, used to form a kind of schools in the streets, in the parks, in different areas, which is open for kids to teach them, because they were like, the Palestinians are really aware of the importance of education in their life. So they are really and truly heroes in that time. But in the 90s, with the Palestinian Authority and the Legislative Council came, and the peace, let's put it between brackets, the peace things came to West Bank and Gaza, the women found themselves are fighting for their own rights. They were fighting for their laws, for put pressure on the Palestinian Authority in the Legislative Council, in the Palestinian Legislative Council, there were no representatives, no women representatives enough as a woman who are half of the society. And even in the government, there are only 2 or 3 ministers of women. And during negotiations, there were no women at all. In the peace process, on track 1, there were no women. So looking at yourself as a woman who fought in the 80s and 70s, and now in the 90s, where are the women? So as if there were like the patriarch just grown up again and revived again against the women, and the authorities, or let's say it, those who are the policymakers and the decision makers, wanted to bring women to their houses, and just, khalas, your role is finished. It's nothing there to do. The occupation is end and everything is fine, so go home, go to raise your kids. So this is the battle and the war for the human rights of the women. Now it is there in the Palestinian Authority, with the Palestinian Authority, even with the help of the UN and other organizations, human rights organizations. But still there are, even now we have like other obstacle and other challenge, which is bringing women back as according to religions, like in other religious movements, like the resistance in Gaza, and even in West Bank. They want to bring women back for religious reasons. So they bring this kind of Sharia and all these terms to bring women to their houses, bring the women back to their houses. So I want just my project with the Rotary is, or in the Rotary, the social initiative change. I want to make that a change, because in the help with many organizations in the world, and even I'm calling for help, because I can't do it by myself. But from this project is empowering women in the non-traditional occupations, because I want to empower women to have their own income, to be financially independent, to bring their decisions by themselves, not to be forced to make that decision. I want to see women free, to have their own perspective, their own visions freely, not to be aware or not to be like afraid from her father or her husband or her brother or even the community itself. So this is my my vision to empowering the woman economically, because I believe that when you are free economically, you are free in many other aspects in life.
Thank you, Suhair, very much. It explains why you're focusing in on that issue, the independence, the freedom that it will give women. And we'll look forward to hearing more about your project and how that turns out. I want to go next to Reem. And Reem, you got into a lot of the information, again, of some stories and also the perceptions that you're having to break through and deal with, and how important that is. And Warren's just mentioning as well, to have those perceptions clear for people to understand, to really move forward on a just resolution. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're working on, the initiatives, the projects for Palestinian human rights and building awareness and changing perceptions in the US and around the world, and what you're doing in the digital realm? You're a specialist with that, so let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So to highlight what I'm doing, it's important to understand how social media and technology has compounded the exclusion and discrimination of Palestinians. So until recently, as 4 years ago, Google did not portray Palestine and its internationally defined boundaries on Google Maps. 136 nations recognize these boundaries as officially sanctioned in the United Nations. Yet, Google neglected to represent these boundaries on their Google Maps platform until recently, and only through large efforts and campaigns from human rights activists. So that's really important to know. Facebook is not innocent in that either. So Facebook has misrepresented the Palestinian voice in 3 ways. And the first one, by arbitrarily blocking accounts from Palestinian activists without any explanation other than these pages had violated community standards or had made a mistake. However, they did not reactivate all the pages and posts. This is a clear example of censorship. Second, Facebook, the Israeli government has used the Facebook posts of Palestinians to arrest individuals with the supposed charges incitement. Many of these Palestinians are detained without any other evidence than Facebook posts. This is an abuse of people's human right of freedom of expression and speech. And third, Facebook officials have collaborated with Israeli policymakers to help define what they deem as community standards. According to Nadim Nsayef, the co-founder of the Arab Center for Advancement of Social Media, the concern is that Facebook is adopting Israeli policy and terminology when it comes to defining what incitement is. So this is really important to keep in mind. So in short, the occupation is present and extended in virtual space. So what is the solution going forward? And to portray that solution and how I came to my work, I want to share a story of hope, because this is really depressing. So this is a story of hope, and it gives us power for an agency. So when in recent events with the rise of the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, I was trying to elevate the story of Palestinian refugees of Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in the occupied East Jerusalem. Those people who lived there are Palestinian refugees who were treated inhumanely by the Israeli occupation. Most recently, Muhammad and Muna al-Kurd, who are brother and a sister refugees in Sheikh Jarrah, have been documenting their terrible experience living in Sheikh Jarrah. They were speaking out against Palestinian refugees being forced out of their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. So they were instrumental in elevating the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah, which is an online movement in solidarity with Palestinians refugees living in Jerusalem. As a result, Muna and Muhammad were both detained by the Israeli police on June 6, 2021, and later released under the pressure of international community and human rights activists. The arrest was a public threatening message by the Israeli occupation to all online Palestinian activists to stop or else. These threats were empowered by virtual social media systems and technology combined with mainstream media bias towards Palestinians. Hamle, which is a nonprofit focused on social media, had received more than 200 campaigns on an early Monday morning during the peak of the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah. These 200 complaints were about deleted posts and suspended accounts related to Sheikh Jarrah. Instagram and Twitter have blamed technical errors for deleting posts mentioning the possible displacement of Palestinians from East Jerusalem. But data rights groups fear discriminatory algorithms are at work and demand greater transparency to no avail. So in conclusion, all these constraints could not suppress Palestinian voices. Mohammed and Muna's voices became louder and more courageous. Their voices echoed with international solidarity, human rights activists, and grassroots pressure. Through online posts and media appearances, sibling activists Mohammed and Muna Al-Kurd provided the world with a window into living under occupation in East Jerusalem this spring, helping to prompt an international shift in rhetoric in regard to Israel and Palestine. In 2021, Muna and Mohammed were named to Time magazine's annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. That's huge. I've never seen a Palestinian on the 100 list of Time, let alone talk about occupation and, yeah. So what is the takeaway from this? There's two takeaways. First, virtual space made our global connection more visible and tangible than ever before. Human rights as a framework can be used to mobilize humanity online. That's important. On social media, numbers matter. And when enough people come around human rights as a framework and a call to action, we overcome the oppressive systems in place, even the virtual ones. Human rights as a framework combined with social media strategies will allow us to build peace on one perception and one system at a time. The second takeaway, media's exclusionary practice towards Palestinians does not contribute to peace, but we should not expect this or wait for it to change. We can create change by collectively elevating the misunderstood and suppressed story of the Palestinians. And with that, I've taken intentionally 2 steps to do this. The first is joining and being part of the core team of the action group that Rukima and Catherine mentioned. And we will share a statement with you shortly, and I will wait on Catherine's for when to do that. And the second, and we would like you all to sign it. The second action that I took is I joined the Founder Institute to actually create a social media platform that discusses news for people who, to allow more voices and more ideas and alternative narratives to come to surface by learning from people around the world about their experiences firsthand, because obviously media is playing a game or intentionally excluding people who are affected by conflicts around the world. So I am working towards creating a company called MediaX for Peace, and I will share with you the link if you'd like to be in touch, and also my email. And now I will leave it to Catherine.
Thank you, Reem. That was awesome. Like you said, a story of hope, things that actually do work and make a difference, and really great analysis. So thank you. We're going to end this round with Suhair, and then we'll head to Reem, who will read our statement about Palestinian human rights and support that we're asking everyone to sign and to distribute as our first major statement and major action in our new Human Rights Rotary Peace Fellows Action Group. And then we've got a great question that was posed to us from, and I'm not sure it's a group, Laurie, John, and someone else, but if you'd like to ask that and then mute at that time, we'll probably pose it to all the panelists. And then I think we'll be coming to our end. So that's just an idea of our last few minutes together. Suhair, We understand that on top of this database and the anti-militarism and all the things that you're working on now in Bradford with Rotary Peace Fellows, you also have worked to protect Palestinian people and land in solidarity with protective accompaniment initiatives in South Hebron, which is a very dangerous place to live if you're Palestinian. And I have seen many, many hard things there over the years, including being shot at a number of times by the soldiers when we were monitoring human rights there, and also in East Jerusalem, which Reem and Suhair and others have brought up. So tell us a little bit more about your initiatives and what you're doing, and as an Israeli citizen that's standing in solidarity against occupation and oppression there.
So I find it, it's a bit of a strange time in my life to have this, to be saying this, because I'm for a change not there. I'll start maybe just saying last week, there was a group of 3 activists, Israeli activists, currently residing in the South Hebron Hills as part of the same accompaniment project that I started a few months ago when I was still on the ground. And so they've been on the ground documenting human rights violations on a daily basis, and they were arrested last week after there was a marathon of settlers in the neighborhood, which closed down all the main roads. And one of the settlers decided that he wants to run into a Palestinian village. And when doing so, he also started by cursing and then also assaulting Palestinians. Things escalated, and these Israeli activists were there to document it. After this whole incident ended, they went to the police station to file a complaint against the settler for assault, and found themselves arrested. At first for assault, eventually the police understood they have zero evidence of that, and then they found themselves arrested for standing idly by, which I just found extremely poetic. Because the main thing that I've seen from living in those areas in the South Hebron Hills has been, when we talk about the army and military reaction to what's happening there, there's 2 parts of it. Part of it is just the violence of occupation, right? So when soldiers come in to demolish a house, that is the violence of occupation. When they come in to arrest people, that is the violence of occupation. But the other part that the soldiers and military do very well in that piece of land is let the settlers do the violence for them, right? The more extreme things that it would look bad if the Israeli military would do, or look even worse, you'll find the settlers doing, right? So we've seen settler attacks in this area. It's an area called Musafariata. It's in the south of the West Bank, South Hebron Hills. We've seen settlers burning fields. We've seen pogroms, massive pogroms on villages with, breaking houses, stoning people, all of these kind of things. And in every single one of those incidents that I was in or other activists, the army was always there. The army was there, and may I quote, standing idly by. And I think that we can talk a lot about the violence of occupation and what it looks like on different levels. But I think one of the things that comes up in the chat here is that everyone on this conversation is very much aware of those. And we can give more examples, and we should talk about it. But if to start with Lori's question a bit earlier of like what gives us hope, or what can we actually do about it, I think for me it is a lot about moving from standing idly by into action, right? And that action gives hope. I can tell you terrible stories about the realities of living in Musafariata, and it will sound strange to you that it was easier for me to feel hopeful living there in that situation with no connection to water or electricity and getting attacked on a regular basis than it is for me to find hope here in Bradford when I read about that. And the reason for that is that action, beyond the fact that it is important politically because it is what creates change, is also something that gives you hope, right? Because you can see what your actions are doing on the ground. And so my main kind of hope for all of us is to be able to move this conversation into action. What does action look like? And obviously, most of us are not on the ground, can't be on the ground. And so we have to find other ways to do that action. So when we talk about, for instance, the violence in Massachusetts, I will say that area is also an area that is currently quite a few villages under the threat of demolition, and there's a campaign towards a Israeli Supreme Court decision about the demolition of a lot of houses in that area. So for instance, that's a campaign that people can just join in on. I'll put the link of kind of what you can do in website of Save Massachusetts in the chat box soon, but that's one thing you can do. The other thing really is about finding what is relevant in your own communities. There are people here from around the world, right? People from the US, we know where US politics is on this issue. How can you push it? As Reem said, we know where US media is on this issue. How can we push it? But it's not just the US. There are people here from all around the world. I've seen quite a few people mentioned from India. So with India, I would say India and Israel have extremely strong relationships, especially around arms export. Right now, India is the importer of 60% of Israeli arms export, right? It's by far the biggest. Those relationships are not just about military, right? There's an ideological relationship between Modi and Netanyahu. We should be talking together about how do we challenge it? How do we present these two leaders and their nationalist ideologies and militaristic manifestations of those as something that is the same, that has the same roots, and then that we can combat the same? How can we learn from each other's tactics and how to combat them? And how can we shift this conversation from just what's happening to how can we change what's happening, and how can we be resisting it together? So that for me is where hope comes from.
Awesome. Thank you, Suhair. And we are going to try to stay about probably 5 minutes over just so we can get everyone's response. I want to head to Reem right now. And Reem, you've put the link in the chat box to the Human Rights in Palestine statement that we developed as a group. We have a very international group of people from across the world, Peace Fellows that have expertise in a number of areas. And I would just like you, if you want to read part of it and tell us what we need to do next in just a couple of minutes. And then we'll end with Suhair and Mazen and yourself just finalizing that question about what gives you hope and keeps you going in the middle of all this.
Thank you, Catherine. So I would like to share the screen and read it out loud. I would like you all to hopefully sign it. And if you want to learn more as well, there's two choices, please go ahead. But I'd like to read it out loud for all of you, because this is us Peace Fellows coming together from all over the world and defining what is it that we need to communicate to the world as Peace Fellows in solidarity with Palestinian human rights and human rights for all. So we're inspired by the quote of Martin Luther King: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Dr. Martin Luther King. As Rotary Peace Fellows, our mission is rooted in a fundamental commitment to human rights. We recognize and support the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which establishes a universal standard of human rights for all people, regardless of politics, ethnicities, or religion. This standard obligates us to hold our institutions, leaders, and policies accountable to meet these universal standards for human dignity and security. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is an Israeli organization, have documented extensive violations of the human rights of Palestinians based on religion and ethnicity in Jerusalem and Gaza, and termed them apartheid in 3 major reports. Having named these truths, both Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations and activists are often attacked, intimidated, and censored for their stance on Palestinians deserving equal human rights. Palestinians are not only denied their human rights in their territories, but these violations are also embodied in global attitudes, institutions, and structures. Though it has recently broken through international headlines, this oppression is not new, but has been occurring for 73 years. This is not peace, and these systems and oppression must stop. We recognize that peace is not isolated by borders, and it requires our international collaboration and solidarity. We express our solidarity with oppressed people everywhere and throughout history. It was right to stand for human rights in the face of the oppression of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and it is right to stand against anti-Semitism in all times. It was right to stand for human rights and work for racial justice in the civil rights movement in the US. It was right to fight for an end to apartheid in South Africa. Today, we stand for human rights for the Palestinians who aspire to freedom and self-determination. This is not a conflict between equal sides, but between one of the most powerful military forces in the world and a people who are prevented from having an army. One of these peoples have power over the other, and the human rights of uninvolved civilians are violated on a daily basis. We declare our duty to educate ourselves, our networks, and the wider community about violence spread by systemic oppression, prejudice, and racism. Addressing human rights is key to advancing mutual understanding and peace. We recognize that positive change will require active listening, difficult conversations, and compassion for those whose perspectives and experiences differ from our own. To honor the countless lives lost or limited to oppression, we promise to raise awareness by elevating the voices of the oppressed to expose the ambiguity where injustice thrives. And with that, I hope you can show solidarity and sign our statement and share it widely with your networks so we can show that we're one voice and that Palestinians deserve their human rights like every other people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem. And I would love for everyone in the audience, there are many people I see that are part of our core working group. If you just put your name in there and say, I'm a member, I see several members that are out there, Rukmini, all of our panelists, I see Kathy, I see Andy, Amanda, there are a number of people that are on the call today that have been really instrumental in putting this together. So if you could just put your name in there, that'd be great. And then I want to end with Suhair and then Suhair, and I just want to give you that question. I'm sorry, Suhair, you've already answered, but let's do Suhair and then Mazen. You had an amazing answer, Suhair, on what gives you hope and what keeps you going in the middle of such a difficult situation over many, many decades. Go ahead, Suhair.
What gives me hope is whenever I'm alive, I have hope. I will never surrender and I will never give up. That one day I will have peace and will have justice in my domestic community and to be free from the occupation. It's the hope is from inside. It's not being from someone. No.
Thank you, Suhair. Thank you so much.
I believe in change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then Mazen, we're going to give you the last word, and then Spencer is going to close us out. Go ahead, Mazen.
Well, I don't know, how I could phrase this, but Howard Zinn had a very nice quote, which I can put in the chat in a couple of minutes, where he talks about hope and that this spinning top of the world, that's going down the hill. There is still hope when, somebody is doing something, and there's always somebody doing positive things. And if we count all the positive, all the lighting of the candles, as you say, better light a candle than curse the dark. Well, we are not going to win over the dark. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the darkness is always there. We're just going to produce some light. And this light, however small or bright we make it, if there is, and there's a big if there's enough people to do that, then the course of history changes. The reason that when you study history, you realize that it is not that the majority of people see the light or engage in lighting candles. It's really that the small minority does this, but they do it with a passion. And when there's a larger number of this small minority, so instead of 1%, it's 2% or 3%, that's when the world changes. If you look at the US, for example, what are the positive things that happened and how did they happen? You know, the right of women to vote, ending the war in Vietnam, civil rights, ending support for apartheid in South Africa, 40-hour work week. All of these things happened because enough people, not a majority, enough people rose from 1 or 2% to 3 or 4%, and they were passionate about it and they pushed for it. So each one of us has to be part of this lighting the candle and keep pushing, because that's how the world changes. And as Arundhati Roy said once, not only is a new world possible, but in a quiet day, I can hear her footsteps. So it is possible.
Yes.
Thank you.
Shukran, Mazam. What a beautiful way to end. And I just want to say I'm so honored to have been a part of this panel. You all have been amazing, and we're hearing a lot of great positive feedback also in the chat. A lot of appreciation for your work and for you and for all you do. And I want to thank Spencer and your amazing Asia Action Group and committee that puts on these webinars, and I'll hand it back to you to close us out today. Thank you for all the participants and being part of us.
Thank you, Catherine. Before I close the event, Rukmini, you want to say some things?
Well, thanks, Catherine, and all the panelists. And well, all I want to say at this point is please join us in support for this human rights group on Palestine, but also you know, the groups that are currently in formation in the context of several other spaces in the world, including Afghanistan right now. So please write to us. You can write to Spencer, me, Catherine, any of us. So we leave our email IDs on the chat, and yeah, do get in touch. There was a question in the chat around, is the human rights group open only to Peace Fellows? No, you're welcome to support in any manner that you can. You don't need to be a Peace Fellow in order to participate in this. So yeah, that's that from me.
Yeah, thank you, Rukmini. Before I close in here, that again, I want to thank Catherine and all the panelists for sharing their stories, you know, the experience in the region in this area. I personally learned a lot about the strugglings in Palestinian Israel in here, and all along while listening, you know, it rings me all the bells over in Asia. You know, we hear all the stories from Palestine in here, then over in Asia is in here, even though it's overshadowed by COVID and the Afghanistan issues in here. You know, in my home country, Hong Kong, we have, you know, people got jailed, you know, 47 people got jailed for a year without putting in a trial. We have Myanmar peoples, you know, young peoples, you know, the military governments put excess force to the protesters. Some got killed. And all these stories are not being broadcast into the general public. You know, human rights is not a single issue. And in over the air, I see issues in, you know, United States, London, England, and everywhere globally in here. When I see the chat about, you know, how do I see hopes? You know, I see hopes because, you know, because of the Rotarian communities in here. The 4-way test of the Rotarians in here is a fantastic yardstick for humanity measures, and it covers human rights if we need to practice as well. One thing that I certainly know well is that in here that, you know, we do have abundance of resources if we collaborated together. You know, if we compete with each other in here, of course, you know, you're going to be scarcities in here, something we learn. And that I learned it from Dr. Maxine in this area, because nature is not competing each other, is which synergies in this area. And on this note, if people like to continue to connect it in here, please feel free to just send me an email to rpfaa.org, and then we have it formalized and connect together, and we can look into take the next steps in here. Before I close this event, what may I suggest? Let's open up the videos. Let's see all the faces, and we have a screenshot. I love to see all these people, and I'm sure all the panelists will see the people in here. They've been fantastic in this area, right? If only if you can, right? If you're willing to. Okay, great.
Spencer and Catherine and others, I'd just like to make a suggestion. Can we like have the conversation be open for a few more minutes if people have questions and answers, and give people the option to stay, just a suggestion. I wonder if people collab if they agree or raise hands. So just an idea.
No, I'm totally fine, okay with it. If people want to stay behind to continue the conversations, feel free to do so in here. But on this note, that I don't want to kind of like drag on for other people. We may have other commitment in this area. Let's have this event corner close. And again, as Rim mentioned in here, if people want to stay behind and talk further about this issue, again, feel free to do so. And you are all welcome, especially Rotarians as well area. Okay. So on this note, I will declare the event closed. And thank you again for participating in the event in here. It's been fantastic learning from everyone. Okay, hope to see you all at our next event. Thank you.
To maybe say goodbye in your own language or your own way. Goodbye, masalama.
إلى اللقاء.
شكرا.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
In Thai is สวัสดีครับ